She answered his letter. Then, standing in the dust of a town she had never seen, with her trunk at her feet and a stranger frowning down at her from the seat of a wagon, she wished with all her heart that she had burned that letter instead. "You're not what I expected," the man said. "Neither are you," she answered. It was not the romantic beginning she had imagined on the long train ride west. She had pictured a smile, a hand offered to help her down. Instead, she got a hard stare, a jaw like a fence post, and a silence that stretched until it hurt. She had crossed half a country to marry this man. And now, looking at him, she was certain she had made the worst mistake of her life. But neither of them understood the truth yet. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She was 26 years old, which in the year 1879 made her something close to a spinster, a word her aunt had used so often it had worn a groove in her heart. She was tall, with chestnut hair she pinned up too tightly and gray eyes that noticed everything. People said she was handsome rather than pretty, and they said it as though it were a disappointment. In Boston she had been a school teacher, a good one. She could quiet a room of 40 children with a single look, and she had taught the daughters of bankers to read Latin and the sons of dockworkers to add sums in their heads. She was patient, sharp-minded, and stubborn in the way that water is stubborn against stone. But Eleanor carried a wound she never spoke of. Her mother had died when she was 9. Her father, a kind but weak man, had remarried a woman who saw Eleanor as a burden, and so Eleanor had learned young that love was conditional, that she must earn her place, that affection could be taken away the moment she stopped being useful. She had been engaged once at 20. He had left her for a girl with a larger dowry, and he had said by way of apology that Eleanor was too much, too clever, too direct, too proud. After that she stopped waiting for love. She told herself she did not need it. But the schoolhouse closed when the new board wanted a married man for the post, and at 26 alone she had answered an advertisement in a mail-order catalog of all things. A rancher in Montana Territory seeking a wife. The letter she received back was brief, plain, and honest. It did not promise her happiness. It promised her work, a roof, and respect. She had read that word, respect, until the paper grew soft. So she came. His name was Caleb Stroud. He was 34, broad through the shoulders, weathered by sun and wind into a man who looked older than his years. His hair was dark, his beard untrimmed, his hands scarred from rope and barbed wire and the thousand small cruelties of ranch work. He spoke little because words had never done him much good. Caleb owned 400 acres at the foot of the Bitterroot Range. He had built the house himself, board by board, after a fire took the first one. He was a hard worker, fair to his hired men, and known across the valley as a man who paid his debts and kept his word. The cattle obeyed him. The horses trusted him. People respected him. But Caleb, too, carried a wound. 3 years before, he had been married. Her name was Sarah, and she had been gentle and laughing and entirely unsuited to the brutal Montana winters. She had died in childbirth in the 2nd year, and the baby with her, on a night so cold the doctor's wagon froze to the road and arrived too late. Caleb had buried them both under the cottonwood by the creek. After that, something in him had closed like a door in winter. He had not wanted another wife. The hands needed feeding and the house had gone to ruin, and the priest in town kept saying a man could not live alone forever. So he had placed the advertisement the way a man sets a trap he hopes nothing walks into. He expected some frightened girl looking for an escape. He told himself he would be decent to her and ask nothing more. What he had not expected was the woman who stepped off the train looking at him, as though she were sizing up a horse she suspected was lame. And so they began with both of them wrong. Eleanor decided in the first hour that Caleb Stroud was cold, rude, and possibly cruel. He had barely spoken on the ride out. He had not asked about her journey. When she remarked on the beauty of the mountains, he had grunted as though beauty were a foolish thing to notice. She thought, he sees me as a servant he ordered through the mail. Caleb, for his part, decided that Alina was proud and soft and citified, a Boston woman who would last one winter and flee. Her hands were smooth. Her speech was careful. She held her chin too high. He thought, she'll break the first hard week, and I'll have wasted my money and my hope. Neither of them said any of this. They simply sat in the rattling wagon, two strangers bound for a wedding neither truly wanted, while the long grass bent gold in the wind. The first clash came that very evening. They were married by the valley priest the next morning, a plain ceremony, no flowers, the words spoken fast. But the night before in the house, Alina had found the kitchen in a state that turned her stomach. Grease on every surface, flour gone to weevils, plates stacked unwashed. She had rolled up her sleeves and begun to clean. And when Caleb came in for supper, she said, without softening it, "How long have you been living like this?" He stiffened. "I work 14 hours a day. I don't have time to scrub pots." "That's no excuse for filth. You've been here an hour and you're already finding fault." "I'm finding dirt," she said. "It's hard to miss." His face went dark. "If the place isn't fine enough for a Boston lady, you can take tomorrow's train back." The words hung there ugly. Alina felt the old wound open, asterisk too much, too sharp, too proud asterisk, but she did not back down. She set the pot on the stove with a clang. "I came here to work," she said quietly, "not to be threatened with a train. If you wanted a frightened girl, you ordered the wrong woman." For a long moment Caleb said nothing. Then he took his hat and went out to the barn and did not come back until she had gone to bed. That night in the cold little room, Alina pressed her face into the pillow and thought, "This will never work." She nearly left. She told herself she would leave. But morning came, and the mountains were pink with dawn, and she had nowhere on earth to go. So she stayed. They married, and the slow, reluctant work of two strangers building a life began. It changed by inches. The first thing Alina noticed was how Caleb was with the animals. She had thought him cold, but she watched him one frozen morning kneel for an hour in the mud beside a heifer struggling to calve, murmuring low and steady, his big scarred hands gentle as a midwife's, until the calf slid free and stood on wobbling legs. He looked at it the way other men looked at sunrises. A cruel man does not do that, she thought. The first thing Caleb noticed was that she did not break. The hard week came as he knew it would. A blizzard sealed them in for 9 days. He expected weeping. Instead, Alina rationed the food without being asked, kept the fire fed through the nights, and when one of the hands took a fever, she nursed him with a competence that startled the doctor. She never once complained. She simply did what needed doing, the way Caleb himself did. A soft woman does not do that, he thought. She found his late wife's books one afternoon, a small shelf of poetry, water-stained, hidden in a chest. She did not pry, but that evening she said gently, "You kept her books." Caleb's hands went still on the harness he was mending. They were hers. "They're lovely," Alina said. "Sarah had good taste." He looked up sharply because he had never told her the name. Alina only nodded toward the family Bible on the mantel, where the name was written. And then she let the matter drop, asking nothing more, and somehow the asking nothing, touched him more than any question could have. The weeks turned. Alina began teaching the ranch hands their letters by lamplight, 3 rough young men hunched over slates like overgrown schoolboys. Caleb watched from the doorway one night, unseen, as she praised a stammering boy for spelling his own name for the first time, and the boy's face lit up like he'd struck gold. Caleb remembered suddenly that he had once dreamed of children running through this house. He turned away before she could see his eyes. She, too, was changing her mind about him. She learned that he gave away beef to the widow Foster down the road and never spoke of it. She learned that the silence she had taken for coldness was really grief, packed down hard so it would not spill. She learned that he rose before dawn and worked past dark not to avoid her, but because work was the only thing that had kept him alive these 3 years. One evening he came in soaked to the bone, having ridden out in a storm to free a calf tangled in wire. Elinor had supper waiting and dry clothes warmed by the fire. He stopped in the doorway, surprised. "You didn't have to wait," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." It was such a small thing. But Caleb sat down at his own table that night and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that it was not empty. Still, neither of them spoke of feelings. They were both too scarred for that. They circled the truth like two people circling a fire, wanting the warmth, afraid of the burn. The turning point came in spring. Elinor had gone to the cottonwood by the creek to gather wildflowers. She did not know at first what the two small wooden crosses meant. Then she read the names. Sarah Stroud, infant. She was kneeling there, the flowers in her lap, when Caleb found her. She froze, ashamed to be caught. But she did not run. She simply said softly, "I'm sorry. I didn't know they were here." Caleb stood very still. And then, in a voice she had never heard from him, low and broken, he began to talk. He told her about the cold, about the doctor's wagon frozen to the road, about holding Sarah's hand as it went still, and the silence where a baby's cry should have been. He told her he had stopped believing he deserved anything good, that he had ordered a wife the way a man orders a tool, never meaning to feel a thing. And he stopped because his voice had cracked clean in half. Elinor rose. She did not offer empty words. She simply took one of the wildflowers and laid it at the foot of the smaller cross. Then she took his scarred hand in both of hers and held it, and they stood together by the graves while the creek ran on and the wind moved through the cottonwood. "You didn't fail them," she said at last. "Loving someone isn't a thing you can do wrong, it's just a thing you do." Caleb looked at her then as though seeing her for the very first time. Not the proud Boston woman he had decided to resent, but Elinor, steady, fierce, kind beneath the iron. A woman who had been told all her life she was too much, standing in front of a man who was only now realizing she was exactly enough. That was the day the wall came down. That was the day it truly began. The summer that followed was the happiest either of them had known. They worked side by side. They talked at supper now, real talk, late into the night. He taught her to ride. She taught him that grief shared was grief halved. There were quiet evenings on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, the mountains turning purple in the dusk. They did not say the word love, but it lived in every small thing they did. Then came the crisis. It arrived in July as a dry wind that did not stop, and a sky the color of brass. The valley had not seen rain in 6 weeks, and on a scorching afternoon, lightning struck the ridge to the west, and within an hour the whole world was on fire. The grass fire came fast, a wall of flame racing across the dry hills straight toward the ranch. The hands scattered to wet the roof and free the horses. Caleb shouted for Elinor to take the wagon and ride for town, to safety. But Elinor had counted heads, and the widow Foster, old and alone, lived directly in the fire's path, 2 miles down the road with no one to warn her. While Caleb fought the flames at the barn, Elinor took the fastest horse and rode straight into the smoke. She found the old woman confused and frightened, got her into the wagon and turned back, but the fire had jumped the road behind her and the way home was a wall of flame. The horses panicked. The smoke turned the world black. Elinor, choking, drove the wagon toward the creek, the only water for a mile, and prayed. Back at the ranch, Caleb turned from the burning fence and saw her horse return without her. Something in him went cold and clear. He did not hesitate. He did not weigh the danger. He swung onto his fastest horse and rode into the burning hills after the woman he had married by mail and come to love with his whole ruined heart, shouting her name into the roar of the flames. He found the wagon stalled at the creek's edge. The 2 women crouched in the shallow water as the fire crowned in the trees above them. He drove the panicked horses across, lashing the wheels. his own coat aflame at the sleeve, and got them through the gap to the bare burned ground on the far side just as the fire swept over the place they had been. He carried Alina out of the smoke in his arms. Her face was black with soot, her hands burned, her eyes streaming, and the first thing she did when she could breathe was ask after the widow Foster. Caleb laughed and wept at the same time, holding her against his chest. "You could have died," he said. "You rode into a fire for a woman who isn't even kin." "She was alone," Alina said simply. "No one should burn alone." And Caleb understood then that this was who she was, the same heart that had refused to leave a frightened child uneducated, a feverish ranch hand unnursed, a grieving man ungrieved with. The too much that every other person had failed to value was the very thing that had just saved 3 lives. The rain came that night at last, hissing down on the smoldering hills. They lost 2 fences and a stretch of grazing, but the house stood, and every soul lived. The valley folk came in the days after to help rebuild, raising fence, sharing seed, the whole community moving as one, the way frontier people did when one of their own was in need. The widow Foster told the story of Alina riding into the fire to anyone who would listen, until the proud Boston woman the valley had eyed with suspicion became, almost overnight, one of its most beloved. But the real change had happened in the smoke. That evening on the porch, with the rain falling soft and clean, and the air smelling of wet ash and new beginnings, Caleb took Alina's bandaged hands in his. "I ordered a wife," he said, "because I'd stopped believing I could love anyone again. I thought I was past it. I thought the best I could hope for was a stranger to share the work." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong about everything. I was wrong about you from the first minute. You're not too much, Alina. You're everything I didn't know I was praying for." Alina, who had been told all her life that love was conditional, that she must earn her place, that affection could vanish the moment she stopped being useful, looked into the eyes of a man who had just ridden into fire for her and asked nothing in return. "I came here for respect," she whispered. "I thought that was all I'd ever get. I didn't know I'd find," her voice broke. "I didn't know I'd find home." He kissed her then, gently, on the porch in the rain, and it was nothing like a marriage of convenience and everything like the thing the poets in Sarah's old books had tried to name. They built a long life on that ranch at the foot of the Bitterroot. Children came, in time, 3 of them, running through the house Caleb had once thought would stay empty forever. Alina opened a small school in the valley, and the daughters of ranchers learned to read Latin under the same patient gray eyes that had quieted Boston classrooms. The cottonwood by the creek survived the fire, and every spring Alina laid wildflowers at the 2 small crosses, and Caleb stood beside her, no longer alone in his grieving. She had stepped off that train certain she had made the worst mistake of her life. He had looked down from his wagon and thought she would break by winter. Both of them had been so sure, and both of them had been so wrong, and that perhaps was the truest thing about love. It rarely arrives looking the way we expect. Sometimes it comes in a plain letter and a hard silence and a man too wounded to smile. Sometimes it comes disguised as a mistake. She had answered his letter and regretted the ride west. She would spend the rest of her life grateful that she made it.